Again. This lecture is entitled Huckleberry Finn's American Epic, and I'm going to discuss how Mark Twain questions every social convention and makes us laugh even this important American novel, but I wanted to share additional information that those works don't entirely cover, those videos don't entirely cover. Um, I want us to consider Huckleberry Finn as an American epic because indeed it is. It involves a journey, it involves a transformative tale with many misadventures along the way. Um, but an epic does more than tell us the long story of an adventure of a hero. It tells us implicitly about the values of a civilization, or sometimes epics point to a lack of good values. It almost certainly talks about the position of God in the civilization. In the ancient Greek world and Roman world, the gods literally intervene in battle scenes, catch spears in the air, and such. Um, that's not the idea of a monotheistic God who is visible and appears and does specific things like that. Um, but I would argue that God is omnipresent in this novel. Um, an epic often offers redemption to the hero after he undergoes trials and becomes transformed by his adventures. If the hero hasn't been transformed, there's a good chance you're not reading an epic. And sometimes that transformation includes redemption. But I clearly, in calling this an epic, am not saying that it resembles the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid, because it doesn't. Here are the differences, or at least some of the differences, between a traditional European epic hero and Huckleberry Finn. The traditional hero is usually a prince or a king or someone destined to become one of those things. He might even be related to the gods. That's pretty typical. He's a warrior. Um, the story is usually told in the third person, meaning uh, here are the things that Odysseus did. Here are the things that Aeneas, pardon me, did. And it's told in narrative poetry. Third person is he, she, it, rather than I, me, my. And narrative poetry is poetry that doesn't just talk to us lyrically about feelings and states of mind, but tells us a discernible story. Most epics that are traditional are actually in narrative poetry. And the hero confronts moral dilemmas and must choose to do the right thing. That's really traditional. He triumphs in the end, often by being called upon to lead or to found the civilization who tells his story in the epic. That's not 100% the case that he founds a civilization or leads a civilization, but it often is. Huckleberry Finn, on the other hand, doesn't fit that paradigm at all. He's not a prince or a king. He's born into the poorest of families. And his daddy is not a god. He is an alcoholic abuser. Huck's not a warrior. He's able to survive in harsh conditions based on the experiences of his childhood and out in the wild. He himself almost behaves at times like a wild creature, but he's no warrior. And his story is told in the first person, I, me, my, and rather than this high-minded narrative poetry, it's prose, it's realist, and it's in the vernacular. Vernacular is the language that people really speak rather than the high-minded, highfalutin language of a civilization. I'll give you an example of where we don't see vernacular. I love the play Romeo and Juliet. I imagine many of you have read it for school. But the teenagers that you know don't sound like Romeo and Juliet on the balcony, in the balcony scene. They don't speak to each other in such eloquent sonnet-style iambic pentameter. They surely talk to each other in similar situations where love is forbidden, but I would imagine that there are more likely texts that read capital U space UP question mark eggplant emoji than the traditional sonnets of Shakespeare, which are magnificent, but not in the vernacular. Even in his day, teenagers didn't recite sonnets extemporaneously on balconies. The Huckleberry Finn chooses to confront moral dilemmas, and he decides, importantly, to protect Jim from the law. So he, in that sense, indirectly resembles the epic hero of the European tradition. He triumphs in the end by refusing to get adopted and to join. He doesn't lead, he departs. He says, all this American civilization stuff is not for me. The American frontier just might be. So a question that ought to be addressed by me and by anyone teaching this book is the controversy over whether Huckleberry Finn is a racist book. I'll leave you to decide that upon reading it. My view is that it is not a racist book. In fact, I think it's an important anti-racist book. But here are the reasons it might be racist. It uses the N-word. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It uses the N-word. And the N-word is racist. And if we look at Huckleberry Finn and his complexity of feelings, his ambivalence, Jim, the runaway slave, is not as richly developed a character. And he behaves in a very subservient manner at times that seems to render him a stereotype. Okay, I acknowledge both points. However, let's look at the other things. Reasons scholars don't generally find it racist includes these. Number one, it uses the N-word because it confronts the racist attitudes of the society it depicts. That's my view. This book is about racism, and it's important that Americans consider racism as a problem, and this book does. The sin our epic's hero must overcome is America's quote-unquote original sin of slavery. Genocide of the Native Americans may indeed be an equal original sin, but I remind you that Columbus's first day in contact with the natives intended to enslave them. That seems to be our original sin as a place to live. And our epic's hero here, if Huckleberry Finn is an epic hero, is to confront that and overcome it. It's true that Jim talks less than Huck, and that would make him seem less developed. But if one imagines for 30 seconds what it would mean to be a slave, would you really tell literally any white person your secret thoughts? In fact, your secret thoughts are all you might ever have that were really yours in slavery. Why would you share a confidence with a white person if you were a slave? Even a white person like Huck. I would suggest that Twain evokes the complexity of Jim's thoughts as he looks at the northern bank of the Mississippi River when he is on the raft with Huck. The great longing he conveys with his gaze is as eloquent as any speech he might have offered about the importance, the necessity of freedom to this man. And there are many times where Jim does rather than says things in the book, and I recommend a careful reading of those moments as a revelation of his character. So here are some things to watch as you read. The first of these is how the Mississippi River symbolizes freedom in this novel. It does other things too, but it certainly seems to evoke freedom. First of all, quite literally for Jim, the northern bank at a certain point in the river is the demarcation of freedom for a runaway slave. It is geographically, eco-critically, a political demarcation of freedom. Therefore, we must understand it to at least mean that in some of what it says about the Mississippi. Um, Floating on the raft, Huck is freer than he is in any house in his hometown, and he's more free to define himself on his own on this raft with Jim. Jim is freer on the raft than he was in the home of his former mistress, to be sure. Um, and so the novel seems to ask, is the American experiment us floating down an unpredictable river with hazards ahead as well as opportunities? Is this what freedom means to America generally? And here are some other things that you might want to take a look for while you're reading. What social conventions does Huck reject? He seems impervious specifically to conventional religious instruction at first when he tells the widow Douglas that if she thinks Tom Sawyer is going to hell, he wants to go to hell too. And then the pivotal moment in the novel, and quite possibly in the entirety of American literature, is when Huck decides to stop treating Jim as if he were a piece of property with the words, "All right then, I'll go to hell." He thinks that by doing the morally right thing and defying social convention, he is destined for hell, a place he believes exists. And so the other social conventions that Huckleberry Finn addresses as a novel, Huck seems to find preposterous. And a word about Mark Twain's general proclivities as a writer is in order here. Mark Twain was funny, and he made fun of Americans while taking them along as in on the joke. He uses humor to criticize many things in this novel through the antebellum South, and they would include hypocrites. Hypocrites are always funny in novels if you do it right. Pearl-clutching piety, by which I don't mean God. These characters believe God is real. They believe that God is a God of judgment as well as mercy. But there is a kind of piety, meaning observance of religion, that seems to exist in some places, not just in the antebellum South, but today, that seems to be fascinated with the sins of other people and to exist to be shocked by them and say, "Oh my goodness, thank God I'm not like that person. That's so bad. That person is bad. Let me find out what else they're doing that's bad." Mark Twain pokes a lot of fun at such people. He also makes fun of family feuds and the ideas of family honor that engender any kind of violence. Alcoholism is both funny and tragic in this novel. Con men are often hilarious in Mark Twain, but again, there's a tragic aspect to them as well for the person who gets conned. And it's not just in the antebellum South or the American frontier that we find con men and Mark Twain. He writes these hilarious short stories about himself in Connecticut getting thoroughly conned by a lightning rod salesman who ultimately, in another short story, as his comeuppance, gets trampled to death by a renegade white elephant on the loose. He thinks con men are a wonderful subject because they open the door to every kind of humor in America. And he makes fun of pretensions of every kind. One thing he thinks real Americans aren't is pretentious. And yet, I ask you in all honesty, do you know no one here in these United States, no one who is pretentious? I know a couple pretentious people for sure. I look in the mirror sometimes and wonder if I'm one of them. Most importantly of all, he is demonstrating a criticism of slavery in this novel, which has some humorous overtones in the end that are questioned by many readers, and I don't blame those readers. The ending is problematic. Um, and so let's talk about that ending. Twain employs the character of Tom Sawyer as a trickster to satirize bad American fiction. Mark Twain hates bad writing. He hates it. Uh, he describes the wrong word in a sentence as opposed to the right one, the difference between having a lightning bug in a jar or an actual bolt of lightning. And when somebody makes a living at bad writing, he is personally offended. And so let's consider for a moment the Native American trickster tradition we studied earlier in the course. The trickster exists to disrupt things and point to the better social values. And Tom Sawyer plays a not dissimilar role here. He disrupts the course of a good American novel, some might say the greatest, by imposing non-realism driven subplots in a realist novel. Jim is free. There's no reason to rescue him. And even if he were not free, Huckleberry Finn suggests a very straightforward way to free him. Just steal a key to the place he's locked up and open the door. But no, we have to follow the plot of a bad novel in Tom Sawyer's game. Twain is conscious of writing a book that a different kind of book that was generally admired in his day. Remember that I'm telling you that Huckleberry Finn was a new kind of novel. And Mark Twain was a serious writer who wrote in a funny way and was considered unpretentious and hence not serious. His heroes in his novel are not poetic in any traditional sense. I find Jim staring across the Mississippi at freedom on the northern bank and not getting there as an extraordinary poetic moment. But in any traditional sense, the guy isn't, the last of the Mohicans, Lochinvar, or any of the other Molly Pitcher, just some of the bad American poetic traditions. Melodrama was incredibly fashionable in Mark Twain's day. He doesn't use melodrama. He just makes us a little sad and sympathetic to his characters through pathos. We don't see, for instance, Huckleberry Finn wringing his hands because his father is such a mean man. He just kind of deals with him pragmatically and gets away from him, faking his own death as a way to escape. But he could have paused and said, "Oh, Father, how could you do this to me?" He avoids any temptation he might have felt to do what others do in other novels. If you consider Dickens, poor Oliver Twist, he tells us how to feel. I argue that Twain is the greater writer because he simply shows us things, and thereby we feel things. And he's too funny for people to suspect him in his day of meaning anything really serious. He's as serious as a heart attack, that Mark Twain, but he writes in a way that relaxes us by making us laugh about the stuff he's talking about. And so Tom, his character, reads all the bad literature Twain hates and absurdly reenacts it within the novel to distinguish Twain from the bad writers he hates. Maybe it's a little bit vain of him to do this. It's also at moments funny, but for the central problem of it, which is there is an element of gratuitous cruelty. Jim is free. All Tom had to say is, he's officially free, so unlock the shed. I mean, that's it. That's everything. And so the cruelty to Jim is frustrating, and seems like the last kick in the teeth of a slavery system in poor Jim's life. Um, and so this is not a perfect novel, but it is a novel that's up to serious business. And ultimately, like many epics, the ending of Huckleberry Finn points to the potential of a happy ending rather than a definite happy ending. We tend to leave the epic hero not when everything is settled in the entire history of the place where he is bound to destiny, but rather at the place where the potential lies and has taken a definite turn. Here are the things that remain as Twain writes the novel and even today. America still has con artists. Con artists in real life are not funny the way they are in Twain, and Twain knows it. America still has hypocrites. God help us. What are we to do? We have so many. We might as well try to sell them overseas. America still has racism. We are still working on that. America still has absurd feuds. One episode of The Real Housewives of Anywhere will tell you that. America still has abused children. God, I wish we did not. Where can our freedom take us? Where can we go from here? Where will we choose to stop and grow up? That's the question for Twain for Huckleberry Finn. And indeed, if Huckleberry Finn in any way represents America at the end of this novel, he is at a place where he has to decide where he is going to grow up. And his answer is indefinite, but it tends westward. What will we build in the wilderness? That's a big question for America. Who are we going to be next as we transform? Huck moves out to uncharted territories, and indeed, as Americans, so do we. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the other videos about this novel as well that I've posted here. Let me know if you have any questions.